They saw the gray streaking her dark hair and thought she was weak. They saw the administrative transfer papers and thought she was a clerk. Colonel Madson certainly did. He looked at Master Sergeant Alara Vance as if she were a piece of misplaced equipment, an error in logistics to be corrected and sent far away from his high-desert training command. But a crisis was brewing under the relentless sun, a test of steel and nerve, and soon she would have to face down the base's most formidable fighter to prove what her redacted file would never say. The instructor would not be ready. None of them were. Alara arrived on a Tuesday, the air thick with dust and the smell of diesel. The transport shuddered to a halt, its ramp lowering with a hydraulic hiss that cut through the monotonous hum of the base generators. She stepped out, one duffel bag slung over a shoulder that seemed too slight to carry it. Her uniform was immaculate, the creases sharp, but it was a garrison uniform, not the combat fatigues worn by every other soldier on the base. It marked her as an outsider, someone from the rear, from a world of paperwork and climate control. Two young specialists, barely out of their teens, stopped their task of loading water canisters to watch her. One nudged the other. "Look at that. Quartermaster Corps finally sent someone to fix the inventory system," the other snorted. "She looks like she could be my aunt's accountant." Alara heard them. She heard everything. It was a skill honed in places where the snap of a twig could mean the difference between breathing and not. She did not react. Her gaze swept the base, a single, fluid motion. It was not a casual glance. It was an assessment. She catalogued the placement of the perimeter watchtowers, the interlocking fields of fire from the heavy machine gun nests. She noted the flow of traffic, the patterns of movement between the barracks, the mess hall, and the command tent. She saw the blind spots. There were 3 major ones, 2 of which could be exploited by a single infiltrator. Her eyes settled on the training yard, a wide expanse of packed earth where a platoon was going through close-quarters combat drills. Her expression remained neutral, a mask of disciplined calm, but inside, she was already dissecting their movements, the inefficiency in their footwork, the wasted energy in their strikes. She walked toward the command tent, her boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the gravel path. The heat was a physical weight, but her breathing remained even, her posture erect. She was a study in stillness amidst a world of frantic, purposeful motion. The guards at the entrance to the command post straightened as she approached, their eyes flicking over her rank and then her face, a flicker of confusion in their expressions. A master sergeant, but one who carried no weapon and wore no armor. It did not compute. "Master Sergeant Vance to see Colonel Madson," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying no hint of the fatigue that should have come with a 12-hour transport flight. One of the guards nodded, speaking into his comms unit. A moment later, he gestured her inside. The air in the tent was cooler, stirred by a pair of industrial fans that did little more than move the hot air around. Maps and digital overlays covered every surface. In the center of it all stood Colonel Madson, a man carved from granite and impatience. He did not look up when she entered. He was leaning over a large holographic map of the surrounding territory, his finger tracing a canyon. "You're Vance," he stated, not asked. His voice was gravelly, accustomed to barking orders that were instantly obeyed. "Your transfer is a mistake." Alara stood at ease, her hands clasped behind her back. "Sir," the single word was neutral, a placeholder. It offered no argument, no defense. It simply acknowledged his statement. Madson finally straightened, turning to face her. He was a big man, his chest broad, his uniform straining at the seams. His eyes were pale blue chips of ice, and they raked over her with open disdain. He saw a woman in her late 30s, maybe early 40s, with a lean build that he mistook for fragility. He saw the threads of silver at her temples and read them as a sign of encroaching age, of a career spent behind a desk. "My command is a spear tip, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We train for the sharp end. We don't have billets for records keepers or supply clerks who've been pushed out of a headquarters unit because they're nearing retirement," he was baiting her. She knew the tactic. Break down a subordinate's composure to see what they were made of. She remained still, a rock in the stream of his disapproval. My orders state I am assigned to this command for special instruction assessment. Colonel, special instruction assessment. He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. That's a bureaucratic term for finding a quiet corner for someone the system doesn't know what to do with. Look around you, Vance. Does this look like a quiet corner? He gestured vaguely toward the tent flap, toward the sounds of shouting and distant gunfire from the ranges. My people are preparing for deployment to the Ashen Frontier. They need to know how to fight, how to survive. They don't need someone to assess their paperwork. Ilara's eyes met his. For a fraction of a second, the mask of placid neutrality slipped, and he saw a flicker of something hard and ancient in her gaze. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. I understand, sir, she said. The Ashen Frontier has unique tactical challenges. His eyebrows rose slightly. She knew the deployment zone. A minor point, but unexpected. That it does, he conceded, his tone still dismissive. Challenges you wouldn't understand from reading a briefing. He walked around the table until he was standing directly in front of her, using his height and bulk to intimidate. It was a common alpha male gesture, one she had encountered dozens of times. I run the most intense CQC training program in the sector. My lead instructor, Sergeant Thorne, is a master. He turns boys into men and men into weapons. I don't have time to babysit an administrative NCO. You will be assigned quarters. You will stay out of the way. You will observe. And when the next transport arrives in 3 weeks, you will be on it. Am I clear? Crystal, sir, Ilara replied. Her voice was as calm as a frozen lake. He had expected protest, or at least a hint of frustration. The utter lack of it seemed to disconcert him more than any argument would have. He stared at her for a long moment, searching for a crack in her composure. He found none. Good, he grunted, turning his back on her. It was a clear dismissal. Sergeant, find a bunk for Master Sergeant Vance. Somewhere quiet, an aide, who had been standing silently in the corner, jumped to attention. Yes, Sir. Ilara gave the colonel's back a crisp, correct salute that he did not see, then turned and followed the aide out of the tent, back into the punishing heat and the judgment of 1,000 eyes. For 3 days, Ilara observed. She was a ghost in the machine of the base, a silent presence that most soldiers quickly learned to ignore. She did not interfere. She did not offer advice. She simply watched. From a shaded bench near the mess hall, she watched the morning formations, noting the subtle signs of fatigue or low morale in the slump of a soldier's shoulders. She saw the cliques, the bonds of friendship, and the subtle currents of friction within the platoons. Her presence was a blank slate onto which they projected their own assumptions. To the young recruits, she was an object of mild curiosity, a relic from a different army. To the seasoned non-commissioned officers, she was an annoyance, a reminder of the bureaucracy that existed outside their gritty, tangible world. To the officers, she was invisible. Her assigned bunk was in a transient barracks, a long metal container converted for habitation. It was noisy and offered little privacy, but she did not complain. She kept her small corner immaculate, her duffel bag stowed neatly, her spare uniform hanging without a single wrinkle. Her routine was simple. She rose before dawn, long before the base-wide reveille call. In the gray twilight, she would move through a series of slow, deliberate exercises. They were not the standard army physical training. They were something else entirely, a fluid sequence of stretches and forms that looked more like a meditative dance than a workout. It was a routine of maintenance, of keeping a finely tuned instrument in perfect condition. Her main focus, however, was the training yard. It was the heart of the base, the crucible where Colonel Madson's spear tip was forged. The lead instructor, Sergeant Kai Thorne, was everything Madson had promised. He was a mountain of a man, fast and brutally efficient. His demonstrations were lessons in controlled violence. He moved with a predatory grace. His instructions barked in a clear, authoritative voice that commanded instant obedience. He was a superb fighter, and the recruits both feared and idolized him. Ilara would sit on the metal bleachers at the edge of the yard, seemingly lost in thought, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched Thorne drill the soldiers in knife fighting, disarms, and hand-to-hand combat. He was good. Very good. His technique was aggressive, powerful, focused on overwhelming an opponent with speed and brute force. It was the standard doctrine for infantry CQC. But Elara saw the patterns. She saw the tells. Thorne favored his right side. His initial attack sequence was almost always a 3-move combination. A jab to the face to draw the guard up, a hard cross to the ribs, and a leg sweep. It was effective against untrained or panicked opponents. She saw how he breathed, the slight intake of air just before he exploded into motion. She saw the way his weight shifted, a subtle telegraphing of his intent. She saw the small, almost imperceptible openings his aggressive style created. A half-second of vulnerability after a missed kick. A momentary imbalance when he put his full weight into a punch. These were not mistakes a normal observer would ever see. They were flaws visible only to someone who had operated on a level of combat that Thorne could not imagine. She also watched the soldiers. She saw their fear, their hesitation. They reacted to Thorne's attacks. They did not anticipate them. They were being taught a set of techniques, a series of pre-programmed responses. They were not being taught how to think, how to read an opponent, how to control the space of a fight. They were being taught to be hammers, when sometimes the situation required a scalpel. On the 3rd day, she watched a sparring session. Thorne, wearing padded protective gear, was taking on 2 recruits at once. He moved between them effortlessly, parrying, blocking, and delivering punishing, but controlled strikes. The recruits were overwhelmed, their movements clumsy and desperate. "Too slow, Martinez," Thorne yelled, sweeping the legs out from under one of them. "You're thinking about the move, not doing it." He spun, blocking a wild punch from the other recruit and putting him in a joint lock that made the young man yelp in pain. "Control the space, Alan. Don't let me dictate the terms." He released the soldier and stepped back, his chest heaving slightly, a sheen of sweat on his brow. His eyes scanned the watching crowd of soldiers, and for a moment, they met Elara's. She did not look away. Her expression was unreadable. He saw her, this strange, quiet master sergeant who just sat and watched, day after day. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He turned back to the exhausted recruits. Again, Elara looked away, her gaze drifting toward the communications tower at the edge of the base. Something was wrong. The primary relay dish was angled incorrectly, pointing slightly downward. The backup emitter beside it had a faint, flickering red light near its power conduit. It was a maintenance issue, a small thing, but in a place like this, small things could become very big things very quickly. The crisis arrived not with a bang, but with a crackle of static. It was mid-afternoon on Elara's 5th day. The heat was at its peak, shimmering in waves off the sand. Colonel Madson was in the command tent, directing a complex, base-wide simulation. It was a stress test, designed to push the base's command and control systems to their limit. The scenario was a coordinated multi-pronged attack, combined with a sudden communications failure. The irony was not lost on Elara, who was standing near the motor pool, ostensibly observing vehicle maintenance procedures. The simulation began as planned. Alarms blared. Soldiers scrambled to their designated defensive positions. The comms net, as per the exercise parameters, went dead. The officers in the command tent switched to a secondary, closed-loop network to manage the attack for 10 minutes. Everything ran according to the script. Then the real failure began. The secondary network, the one not part of the simulation, started to degrade. Voices became distorted, then cut out entirely. The holographic map in the command tent flickered and died, replaced by a system offline message in stark red letters. In the comms shack, a young lieutenant stared in horror at his console. Every channel was dead. Not simulated dead. Actually truly silent. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of the base's disciplined facade. "What's happening?" Madson's voice boomed across the command tent. "Get it back online. Now!" A communications specialist, sweat beading on his forehead, frantically typed commands into a terminal. "I can't, sir. The primary and secondary relays are completely unresponsive. It's not the software, it feels like a total hardware failure." Maybe the main power conduit. The simulation is over. Madson roared into a dead microphone. All units, cease exercise. Cease. His voice trailed off as he realized no one could hear him. The alarms were still blaring. The soldiers on the perimeter were still locked in their simulated firefight, wasting ammunition and following the last orders they had received. They were blind, deaf, and alone, trapped in a scenario that was no longer a game. The panic began to spread. Officers started shouting at each other. The well-oiled machine of the base was grinding to a halt, its gears stripped by confusion. Outside, Alara felt the shift. The rhythm of the base, the predictable cadence of the drill, was broken. The shouts from the command tent were no longer controlled. They were frayed, edged with fear. The soldiers on the line were firing with a little too much enthusiasm, the discipline of the simulation beginning to fray into genuine chaos. She saw the young lieutenant from the comms shack run out of the tent, his face pale. He was heading for the main communications tower, a wrench in his hand, a look of desperate purpose on his face. It was the wrong move. He was a software technician, not a hardware engineer. He would likely make the problem worse, or worse, electrocute himself. The backup generator for the tower had a notoriously faulty regulator. Alara began to move. She did not run. She walked, her pace swift and sure. It was a walk that ate up the ground, a predator's stride that was deceptively fast. She cut across the training yard, ignoring the stares of the few soldiers not involved in the drill. Her path was direct, not a single wasted step, calculated to intercept the lieutenant before he reached the tower's access ladder. She reached the base of the communications tower just as the young lieutenant was fumbling with the lock on the access panel. "Lieutenant," she said. Her voice was calm, cutting through his anxiety. He jumped, startled, and spun around, the wrench held like a weapon. "Who? Master Sergeant? I don't have time. I have to." "You're a network systems officer," Alara stated, not asked. "Your specialty is code, not high-voltage conduits." The lieutenant stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "How did you?" "The main relay dish is misaligned," she continued, her voice level and methodical. "It's a mechanical slip, probably from thermal expansion. It's causing the primary system to hunt for a signal it can't find, which is drawing triple the normal power and has likely blown the main breaker. The backup emitter has a faulty regulator. When the primary system failed, the automated switchover to the backup caused a power surge that fried its control board. The red light has been flickering on it for 3 days. She delivered the diagnosis in a flat monotone, as if reading a grocery list. The lieutenant's panic was replaced by sheer, unadulterated astonishment. He looked from her to the tower and back again. "How in the hell could you know that?" "I observe," she said simply. "Give me the wrench." He handed it to her without thinking, his mind still trying to process her words. "Going in there now will get you killed and solve nothing," she told him. "The problem isn't in the tower. It's in the junction box." She turned and walked 20 paces to a small, nondescript gray box mounted on a concrete block, half hidden by a scrubby desert bush. The lieutenant had run right past it. Alara knelt. The box was secured with a standard hex bolt lock. She didn't have the key. She looked at the wrench in her hand, then at the lock. She wedged the claw end of the wrench into the tiny gap between the panel door and its frame. With a precise, controlled application of leverage, there was a sharp crack and the lock broke. She opened the panel. Inside was a complex web of wires and breakers. Just as she had predicted, the main breaker was flipped. Beside it, a smaller fuse for the backup system's regulator was blackened and melted. "We need to bypass the backup and reset the primary," she said, more to herself than to the lieutenant. "But we have to realign the dish first, or it will just trip again." She looked up at the tower. "Call the motor pool. Tell them I need 2 privates and a manual winch kit." Now the lieutenant, jarred from his stupor by the command in her voice, fumbled for his personal radio, then remembered it was useless. "The comms are down." "Then run," Alara said, not unkindly. Fast he ran. While she waited, she used the handle of the wrench to carefully disconnect the melted fuse. ensuring the circuit was broken. She studied the schematic printed on the inside of the panel door, her eyes tracing the power flows, confirming her initial assessment. 2 young privates arrived moments later, breathless, a heavy winch kit between them. They looked at Alara, then at the open panel, their expressions confused. They had only ever seen her sitting on the bleachers. "The winch is for the dish," she said, pointing up. "There's a manual crank assembly for maintenance. One of you will need to go up there." They looked at the towering height of the relay, then at each other, their uncertainty plain. "I'll go." One of them, a wiry kid named Sanchez, finally volunteered. "What do I do?" "I'll talk you through it from here," Alara said. She then turned to the lieutenant who had returned. "I need you in the comms shack. The moment I reset this breaker, the system will reboot. It will take 90 seconds. You need to be ready to reestablish the network protocols." He nodded, his earlier panic replaced by a focused determination. He now looked at her not as an old clerk, but as an authority. He sprinted back toward the command tent. Alara looked back at the tower. "Sanchez," she called out, her voice carrying easily. "Start climbing." The base was still in chaos, but here, at the foot of the silent tower, a small pocket of order had formed around a woman they thought was just a clerk. Colonel Madson stood amidst the barely controlled pandemonium of his command tent. "Someone give me a runner," he bellowed. "I want a message taken to every platoon sergeant on the line. Cease the exercise. Conserve ammunition." An officer scrambled to obey. Madson ran a hand over his face, his expression a mask of fury and frustration. His perfect simulation, his ultimate stress test, had been ruined by a simple equipment failure. Worse, it had exposed a critical vulnerability. Without communications, his vaunted spear tip was just a collection of confused men with guns. He felt a profound sense of helplessness, a feeling he despised. His eyes fell on the chronometer. 15 minutes of total silence. An eternity in a combat situation. Suddenly, a single monitor on the far wall flickered to life. It showed a diagnostic screen, lines of code scrolling rapidly. The communications specialist stared at it. "Sir, I've got a system reboot. Someone's resetting the main power from the outside." Madson strode over to the console. "Who? I didn't authorize anyone." "I don't know, sir, but the system is coming back online. It's a hard reset, bypassing the backup relay entirely." A moment later, the main holographic map sputtered back to life, showing the positions of all units. A voice crackled over the command channel speaker. "Command, this is Comms Shack. We are back online." All channels green. The relief in the tent was a physical thing. The shouting died down to murmurs of disbelief and gratitude. Madson grabbed the microphone. "All stations, this is command. The exercise is terminated. I repeat, the exercise is terminated. Acknowledge." A wave of acknowledgments flooded the channel. Order was restored. Madson let out a slow breath, his anger already being replaced by a cold, sharp curiosity. "Who fixed it?" he demanded, turning to the specialist. "Find out who was at that junction box." A young officer who had been near the tent's entrance stepped forward. "Sir, I saw Lieutenant Miller running toward the tower." He looked panicked. Then, Master Sergeant Vance followed him. Madson's head snapped around. Vance? The name was absurd in this context. The quiet, graying clerk. It made no sense. "Yes, sir," the officer confirmed. She went directly to the tower. The colonel's skepticism warred with the undeniable fact that his command had just been saved. He walked to the tent's entrance and looked out. In the distance, he could see a small group of figures at the base of the communications tower. He saw the lieutenant. He saw 2 privates lowering something. And he saw her, Alara Vance. She was standing with her back to him, directing the privates as they secured the winch kit. She moved with an economy of motion, a quiet authority that was unmistakable even from 100 yards away. The way she stood, the set of her shoulders, the calm efficiency of her gestures. It was not the posture of a clerk. It was the posture of a professional. Sergeant Thorne had also noticed the commotion. The abrupt end of the drill and the sudden restoration of communications had left his trainees confused. He dismissed them and walked toward the tower, his own curiosity piqued. He saw Vance talking to the lieutenant, who was nodding eagerly, listening with the rapt attention of a student. Thorne slowed his approach, his brow furrowed. He had dismissed her as background noise, another administrative burden. But what he was seeing did not fit that picture. The two privates, Sanchez and the other one, were packing up the gear. Sanchez caught Thorne's eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a look of awe on his young face. Madson began walking toward the group, his stride long and purposeful. The disconnect between the woman he had dismissed and the woman who had just single-handedly restored his command and control network was a chasm he needed to cross. He saw her turn as he approached, her face betraying no emotion. She simply watched him come, her hands resting calmly at her sides. The observers, the young soldiers, the junior officers, even Sergeant Thorne, were all starting to rethink their initial assumptions. This quiet woman was more than she appeared. The dismissal was evaporating under the harsh desert sun, replaced by a growing, unsettling curiosity. Colonel Madson stopped a few feet from Alara. Lieutenant Miller and the two privates instinctively stiffened to attention. Alara remained at ease, her posture unchanged. She looked at the colonel, waiting. "Master Sergeant," Madson began, his voice devoid of its earlier condescension. It was flat, inquisitive. "Report. The primary relay's alignment had slipped, sir," she said, her tone as factual as ever. "It caused a power overload that tripped the main breaker. The backup system's regulator was faulty and blew a fuse during the switchover. I bypassed the backup, had the dish manually realigned, and reset the primary breaker." Lieutenant Miller handled the network reboot from the comms shack. She delivered the information without a hint of pride or self-importance. It was a simple statement of facts. Madson looked from her to the tower, then to the junction box with its broken lock. He understood the sequence of events. What he didn't understand was her. "You're not a communications technician," he stated. "Your file says you're administrative staff." "I am, sir," she confirmed. "My last posting was with the Joint Records Command." He stared at her, the pieces not fitting. "And where did you learn to diagnose and repair a Class 4 comms relay system in the middle of a total blackout?" "I pick things up," she said, the answer deliberately vague. It was a deflection, and they both knew it. Madson was not a man who tolerated deflection. His eyes narrowed. He was being challenged, not by insubordination, but by an infuriating lack of information. He had built his career on knowing his people, on understanding their strengths and weaknesses. Vance was a blank space, a variable he couldn't quantify. His authority had been subtly undermined, not by a challenge, but by sheer, quiet competence that had appeared out of nowhere. Sergeant Thorne had been listening from a short distance away. He stepped forward now, a look of professional interest on his face. "That was some quick thinking." Master Sergeant Alara turned her head slightly to acknowledge him. The problem presented a clear solution. Thorne grinned, a flash of white teeth in his sun-darkened face. It was the confident grin of a man who believed he was the best at what he did. "Most people freeze when the lights go out. You didn't." He looked her over again, his gaze different now. It was appraising, the way a fighter sizes up a potential opponent. He saw the lean muscle in her forearms, the way she held her center of gravity. He was seeing her for the first time. "You handle pressure well?" Thorne continued, his voice taking on a challenging edge. "But it's one thing to fix a machine. It's another to face a man who's trying to break you." Colonel Madson saw his opportunity. This was the perfect test. Thorne was his instrument, the measure of all men on this base. If Vance had some hidden depth, Thorne would find it. He would expose it, quantify it, and put it back in a box that Madson could understand. "My instructor raises a good point, Master Sergeant," Madson said, his voice smooth. "My soldiers need to be ready for any kind of pressure. Physical, mental, emotional. Sergeant Thorne is responsible for their CQC readiness. He ensures they are prepared for the worst kind of stress." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Perhaps you have some insights that could benefit his training program. Given your unique observational skills, it was a trap laid in plain sight. A challenge disguised as a polite request. If she refused, she would be seen as backing down, her earlier heroism a fluke. If she accepted, she would have to face Thorne, the base's undefeated champion, in his own arena. The small crowd of soldiers that had gathered was silent, watching the drama unfold. They had seen what Thorne did to trained fighters. This quiet woman stood no chance. Alara's gaze moved from Madson to Thorne. She saw the challenge in the colonel's eyes and the professional pride in the sergeant's. She understood the test she was being given. It was not about CQC training. It was about putting her back in her place, or proving she belonged in a different one entirely. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm always willing to contribute to soldier readiness." Sir Thorne's grin widened. "Excellent. The training yard. Tomorrow 0800. We can run through some basic disarming techniques. A demonstration. Alara repeated, her expression unreadable. She looked at Thorne, then back at the colonel. "Yes, sir. I will be there." Madson gave a curt nod, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. The situation was back under his control. The anomaly of Master Sergeant Vance would be explained, one way or another, on the packed earth of the training yard. As he and Thorne walked away, the sergeant leaned in toward the colonel. "Don't worry, sir," Thorne said in a low voice. "I'll be gentle." Madson didn't answer. He was no longer certain that would be necessary. He was no longer certain of anything when it came to her. The next morning, the air in the training yard was thick with anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire. The quiet Master Sergeant, the clerk who had somehow fixed the comms, was going to spar with Sergeant Thorne. The entire off-duty contingent of the base seemed to be there, lining the edges of the packed earth pit. They stood on bleachers, sat on hoods of vehicles, and perched on stacked supply crates. It had the atmosphere of a championship fight. Colonel Madson stood on a raised platform, his arms crossed, his face an impassive mask. He told himself this was a training exercise, a way to vet an unknown asset. But he knew it was more. It was a reassertion of the established order. Alara arrived at precisely 0800. She wore standard physical training gear, simple gray shorts and a t-shirt. She carried no gear, no water bottle. She walked through the murmuring crowd, which parted for her silently. Her face was calm, her eyes focused. She looked small and unassuming compared to Thorne, who was already in the center of the pit, stretching his powerful limbs. He was shirtless, his torso a roadmap of muscle, his knuckles taped. He looked like a pit fighter, a gladiator in his element. He grinned as she approached. "Glad you could make it." Master Sergeant Alara stopped 10 feet from him. "Sergeant." The colonel thought it would be instructive for the troops to see some different approaches to CQC. Thorne said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "We'll start with a simple knife disarm. I'll be the attacker. Your job is to control the weapon and neutralize the threat. Ready?" He produced a rubber training knife from his waistband. Alara nodded once. She settled into a ready stance. It was not a stance Thorne recognized. It was relaxed, her weight perfectly centered, her hands held loosely at her sides. It looked passive, almost vulnerable. It was a trap. Thorne lunged. He didn't ease into it. He attacked with the same explosive speed he used on the recruits. The rubber blade slashed in a vicious arc aimed at her throat. The crowd gasped. Alara did not retreat. She moved less than 6 inches. Her body swayed back just enough for the blade to pass a whisper's breadth from her neck. At the same time, her left hand shot out, not to grab his wrist, but to cup his elbow. Her right hand came up under his forearm. It was not a block. It was a redirection. Using his own momentum against him, she guided his arm past her, twisting his elbow joint in a way it was not meant to bend. Thorne, caught completely by surprise, stumbled forward, his balance broken. Before he could recover, Alara pivoted on her heel. She didn't try to throw the larger man. She simply moved with him, collapsing his structure. Her leg swept behind his, and with a gentle final push at the small of his back, she sent him tumbling to the ground. He landed hard on his side, the rubber knife skittering away across the dirt. Took less than 2 seconds. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. They had just seen their champion thrown to the ground with what looked like effortless grace. Thorne lay on the ground for a second, the wind knocked out of him more by shock than by the impact. He pushed himself up, his face a mixture of disbelief and dawning respect. He had never been countered so smoothly. "Luck," he grunted, getting to his feet and retrieving the knife. "My mistake. I underestimated you. You committed to the attack before you knew my response," Alara said, her voice still quiet, but now it carried the weight of authority. "You relied on speed and power. You didn't control the space." Thorne's eyes narrowed. She was using his own words against him. "Again," he growled. This time he was more cautious. He feinted, testing her reactions. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were locked on his center, not his hands or the knife. He launched a flurry of attacks, a combination of slashes and stabs. Alara moved like water. She flowed around him, her hands parrying, deflecting, never meeting his force with her own. Each time he attacked, she used his energy to create an opening, to offset his balance. She wasn't fighting him. She was dismantling him. After 30 seconds of his fruitless attacks, Thorne was breathing heavily, his frustration mounting. He lunged again, a powerful stabbing motion aimed at her center mass. This time, Alara met him. As his arm extended, she stepped in, not away. Her left hand clamped down on his wrist, pinning the knife. Her right palm struck the side of his neck, at the pressure point below the ear. It wasn't a powerful blow, but it was precise. Thorne's vision went white. His entire right side went numb. His knees buckled, and he dropped to the ground, the knife falling from his nerveless fingers. He was not unconscious, but he was completely incapacitated. Alara stood over him, her breathing perfectly even. She hadn't even broken a sweat. The silence from the crowd was now one of absolute awe. On the platform, Colonel Madson stared, his jaw tight. He had seen fighting his whole life. He had never seen anything like this. This wasn't a brawl. It was an execution. He looked at Alara, at her calm demeanor, the utter lack of triumph on her face. A cold dread, mixed with a profound sense of discovery, washed over him. He turned to his aide. "Get me her full, unredacted service record," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "I want it now. Top priority override." "My authority." As Alara bent to pick up the training knife, her t-shirt rode up slightly in the back. For a fleeting second, a tattoo was visible at the base of her neck, just above her shirt collar. It was a small, stylized image, a coiled serpent with a single spectral wing. Only a handful of people in the entire military would have recognized the symbol. It was the mark of a ghost, a member of a unit that did not officially exist. Unit 734, the Wraiths. The aide returned less than 5 minutes later, a datapad in his trembling hand. He approached the colonel, his face pale. "Sir, I have the file." Madson snatched the datapad. He didn't look at the aide. His eyes were still fixed on the scene in the pit below. Sergeant Thorne was on his feet now, being helped by 2 of his assistant instructors. He wasn't looking at them. He was staring at Alara Vance with an expression of profound, unadulterated respect. She was simply standing in the center of the pit, waiting, as if nothing had happened. Madson tapped the screen of the datapad. The file opened. Master Sergeant Alara Vance. The first page was the standard service record he had already seen. Administrative posts, commendations for logistical excellence, a clean, unremarkable career path. He swiped to the next page. Access denied. He swiped again. Access denied. He swore under his breath and entered his highest level command override code. The screen flickered, and new text appeared. Classification. Onyx Protocol. Eyes only. The screen resolved into a new file. The name was the same, but the history was vastly different. Alara Vance. Attached to Special Activities Division, Unit 734. The service history was a long list of redacted locations and dates. Ashen Frontier, Cygnus Gap, the Obsidian Ridge Incursion. These were not places you sent clerks. They were the blackest of black operations, ghost wars fought in the shadows. He saw commendations that were themselves classified, medals that were never worn, awarded for actions that never officially happened. He scanned the list of specializations: advanced infiltration, unarmed combat, master level, counterintelligence, zero signature movement, psychological operations. Her proficiency rating in hand-to-hand combat was listed as Tier 1+, a designation Madson had never even seen before. It was above the scale. Then he saw the call sign, Wraith. His blood ran cold. He had heard whispers of the Wraiths. They were myths, bogeymen that senior commanders told each other about in hushed tones. They were the operatives sent in when everything else had failed, surgical instruments used to solve impossible problems. They didn't exist, and yet one of them was standing in his training yard. He looked down at her file again at the last entry. Subject honorably discharged from active special duties following injuries sustained during Operation Nightfall. Reassigned to Joint Records Command for recuperation and low-impact service injuries. He looked at her, standing there perfectly calm, having just dismantled his best fighter without effort. What kind of injuries? The file didn't say. It didn't need to. The fact that she was still standing was a testament to a will he couldn't begin to comprehend. He finally understood. The transfer wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a quiet retirement. It was a place for a legend to heal, hidden in plain sight. They hadn't sent him a clerk. They had sent him a weapon that had been holstered. Down in the pit, Thorne walked back toward Alara. He stopped in front of her. The crowd watched, silent. He did not extend a hand. Instead, he came to the position of attention, his back ramrod straight. He raised his hand in a slow, formal salute. It was not the casual salute between peers. It was the salute a soldier gives to a superior officer, or to something they hold in the highest esteem. A sign of ultimate respect. "Master Sergeant," Thorne said, his voice clear and steady, all traces of his earlier arrogance gone. "Thank you for the lesson." Alara met his salute with a simple, brief nod. It was all the acknowledgement he needed. She turned and began to walk out of the pit. The crowd of soldiers, who had been a murmuring, mocking entity just minutes before, parted for her like the sea. They stared at her with a new understanding. They saw the quietness not as weakness, but as control. They saw the stillness not as passivity, but as a sign of immense, coiled power. They didn't know the details. They didn't know about Unit 734 or the call sign Wraith, but they knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. They knew they were in the presence of a master. The respect was immediate and absolute. It was not loud or demonstrative. It was quiet, deep, and pervasive. It settled over the base like the evening cool. No one spoke of the sparring match in loud tones. It was discussed in hushed, reverent whispers in the barracks and the mess hall. The story was told and retold, each telling adding another layer to the legend of the quiet master sergeant. The young specialists who had called her an accountant now avoided her gaze, their faces flushed with shame whenever she passed. The seasoned NCOs who had seen her as a bureaucratic nuisance now straightened their shoulders and gave her crisp nods of acknowledgement. They saw in her the embodiment of a standard they had all aspired to but few had ever reached. The change was most profound in Colonel Madson. He walked down from his observation platform, the datapad still in his hand. He met Alara as she was leaving the training yard. The remaining soldiers watched, holding their breath. Madson stopped in front of her. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the fatigue deep in her eyes, a weariness that had nothing to do with the day's exertions. He saw the rigid control she held over herself, and he finally understood that it was not just discipline. It was a cage, holding back a history of violence and pain he could barely imagine. "Master Sergeant Vance," he said. His voice was different. The gravel was still there, but the arrogance was gone, replaced by a formal, almost humbled tone. "Your file is incomplete." Some things don't fit on the page, sir, she replied, her voice as even as ever. No, he said, shaking his head slightly. They do not, he paused, searching for the right words. The training on this base is under my command. But expertise. Expertise has its own authority, he held out the datapad. Your assessment of Sergeant Thorne's CQC program. I'd like to read it. Officially, it was his way of ceding ground, of acknowledging her superior knowledge. It was an apology and a job offer rolled into one. Alara took the datapad. I'll have it for you by tomorrow, Colonel. Thank you, he said. He then did something no one on the base had ever seen him do for an enlisted soldier. He offered his hand. Alara looked at it for a moment before shaking it. Her grip was firm, dry, and professional. The handshake was brief, but it was a treaty. A transfer of power, freely given and quietly accepted. The public act of respect from both Thorne and Madson solidified her new status. She was no longer an outsider. She was an asset, a guru, a quiet legend in their midst. Over the next 2 weeks, the base transformed. Following the recommendations in the report she submitted, the CQC program was overhauled. Alara did not take over the training. She advised. She worked with Thorne, who became her most dedicated student. She didn't teach them her style. She knew it was too specialized, too lethal for standard infantry. Instead, she taught them principles. Efficiency, situational awareness, control. She taught them how to see, how to anticipate, how to turn an opponent's strength into a weakness. She moved among the soldiers, a quiet instructor offering a soft-spoken correction here, a small adjustment there. Her presence raised the level of everyone around her. She never raised her voice. She never had to. A simple look, a quiet word, was enough. The soldiers hung on her every syllable. They learned to value precision over power, thought over blind aggression. Their respect for her was matched only by their respect for Sergeant Thorne, who had been great enough to recognize a master and humble enough to learn from her. He became an even better instructor, his teaching now infused with a depth it had previously lacked. The base became more efficient, more lethal, not through shouting and brute force, but through quiet, focused intensity. It was her intensity. The 3 weeks passed quickly. The day the transport was scheduled to arrive, the one Colonel Madson had promised she would be on, dawned clear and cool. The base went about its morning routine, but there was an undercurrent of tension. No one knew if she was truly leaving. Her original orders had not been changed. Alara packed her single duffel bag in the quiet of her now private room. She had been moved from the transient barracks the day after the sparring match, on the colonel's direct order. Her uniform was pressed, her boots polished. She was ready to move on, just as she always was. She walked out of the barracks and headed toward the transport field. Along the way, soldiers stopped what they were doing. A mechanic working on an engine wiped his hands and stood straight. A squad jogging past slowed to a walk. No one spoke. They simply watched her pass, their expressions full of a respect that was deeper than any medal could signify. At the edge of the transport field, Colonel Madson and Sergeant Thorne were waiting for her. The transport's ramp was down, its engines whining. "Master Sergeant," Madson said, "the transport is here." "So I see, sir," she replied. "My next assignment is pending," Madson continued, looking not at her but at the horizon. "They're giving me a sector command." In the ashen frontier, he turned to face her. "The offer is open. I'm authorized a senior enlisted advisor. The post is yours if you want it. Your Real file would be on my desk, and your duties would be whatever you determine them to be." It was the ultimate gesture of trust. He was offering her a place at his side, a position of undefined authority, a home. Sergeant Thorne stood silently beside him, his expression hopeful. Alara looked at the colonel, then at Thorne. She looked out at the dusty, wind-swept base that had become an unlikely sanctuary. For a moment, she considered it. The thought of staying, of having a place, was a powerful lure. But the Wraiths were not meant to have homes. They were meant to be ghosts passing through, fixing what was broken, and moving on. Her work here was done. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. and the sincerity in her voice was absolute. But my path is elsewhere. There are other records that need assessing. Madson nodded slowly, a look of understanding and regret on his face. He had expected the answer, but it didn't lessen the disappointment. Understood, he said. He saluted her. This time it was not a formality. It was a farewell from one professional to another. Thorne saluted as well, his own respect silent and profound. Elara returned the salutes with a crisp nod, then turned and walked up the ramp into the belly of the transport without looking back. The ramp hissed shut, and the aircraft lifted off, its engines roaring to life and kicking up a storm of dust. Colonel Madson and Sergeant Thorne stood watching until it was just a speck in the vast, empty sky. The base was quiet now, the sounds of training momentarily stilled. The soldiers were looking up, watching her go. She had arrived as a mystery and left as a legend. In the training yard, a young private was practicing the fluid, efficient knife disarm she had demonstrated. He was slow, clumsy, but he was thinking. He was learning. Her presence was gone, but her lesson, the quiet dignity of her earned respect, remained. It was burned into the memory of the base, a permanent part of its structure, more solid and lasting than any building of steel or concrete. They would not forget the woman they thought was weak.